Ms. Greer.
Thank you. Good morning.
Morning.
Yesterday we had just finished talking about identification, and I'd like to ask you just a few more questions about that, if I may. Just to recap, we'd been talking about the events in the morning of the 3rd of May 2015, and at that stage there was an unknown male, an unknown black male in Victoria Hospital. Both DS Dursley gave evidence and you gave evidence yesterday that identification at that stage was a priority. So you didn't know at that stage who the man in the hospital was.
That's correct.
You talked about, I think, both of you recognising in the morning when you were sharing a room that there may be a link or a connection with the call from Colette Bell.
Yes.
That she'd made a call to the police and she'd talked about her partner not being at home. She'd had a call from a friend about her partner acting bizarrely. I think you talked about, you were aware that there had been a number of telephone calls from members of the public about someone acting strangely near Henry Road. The locations of those two properties, of Hayfield Road, Henry Road, and the address of Colette Bell were quite similar, and you were aware of all of that.
Yes.
So both of you and DS Dursley made that possible or potential connection there. I think we've heard evidence that Colette Bell had talked about her house being trashed. And then we heard evidence from DS Dursley that there was mention by Colette Bell of a gold mobile phone.
That's correct.
Were you aware that there had been a mention of a gold mobile phone?
Yes, I definitely was. At what point in the proceedings, I'm unsure.
We had heard evidence from DS Dursley that, and this was something he'd noted in his daybook, that information he'd received from Mitchell and Parker when they went to the home of Colette Bell, and that he'd noted that in his daybook. So that's something you were also aware of, roughly.
Yes.
In the morning anyway. And just to be clear about the sort of steps that police officers can take when they have an unknown person and they're trying to identify that person. So we heard from DS Dursley that he'd obviously sent officers to Colette Bell's house.
Yes.
We heard from DS Dursley that he'd asked a member of staff to do searches on a CHS system.
Criminal history system, yeah. That's a police system.
Right. And we talked yesterday about the social media, the use of social media and the checks that were done, I think, on Facebook. What other steps can police officers take if they're trying to identify an unknown person?
So if we encounter somebody that's not able to tell us their identity, there may be items in their possession that gives an indication. So a photographic identification, a driving licence, any other personal effects, but also as part of those checks on police systems, if they are known to the police in terms of any previous episode, we could sometimes record mark scars, tattoos, so it's another searchable function in terms of attempting to identify a person.
We heard from DS Dursley that there, at some point, he couldn't give us an exact time, but at some point during the morning he was advised that a gold mobile phone had been found at the scene in Hayfield Road. Was that something that you were aware of?
Yeah, I think at that time, and even prior to me contacting DS Dursley, my conversations with DS Davidson, our focus at that time is who is this man? And I think the discussions at that time, I'm unsure if there was any cursory search of clothing for those personal effects or identification, but I recall the only item that possibly could identify him was his phone. Obviously significant in terms of the colour, but also potentially to use that phone to try and identify the person as well, in terms of if it was unlocked through phone numbers to make contact with a friend or contact number on that.
And so the colour of the phone, without even accessing it in any way, was that something else that provided a possible connection to other information you had?
And a bit more distinctive than just a normal phone.
Were gold phones common in those days?
I don't think so. Well, I can tell you, uncommon to me.
Uncommon to you.
Yeah.
And then we may also be aware of things like dental records that can be recovered. Is that something that police officers can do?
That would probably be me into the post-mortem phases. So again, there's been circumstances that we've tried all those efforts and inquiries to identify. Again, is that person as well visually identifiable? If they're not, we may have to go down the forensic route in terms of DNA, odontology, in terms of obviously dental records.
How long would that type of thing take in Kirkcaldy in 2015? If you did have to go down that?
Well, it wouldn't be our responsibility. It'd be in
No.
consultation with Procurator Fiscal in terms of having primacy for death investigations in Scotland.
Would that take longer in terms of getting DNA and
Definitely,
maybe dental records?
Because it's a process. You would have to obviously identify the professionals who would conduct that, and in terms of their specialism, I don't know how long it takes to return those results. It's not instantaneously, what I would say.
And you've mentioned the fiscal. What sort of assistance can the fiscal provide to officers in relation to maybe assessing identification or getting identification?
I'm not sure they would assist with identification, but obviously we would consult them, as I say, having primacy for deaths, in terms of potential our challenges and what efforts we had done to try and identify. And then thereafter they may have to consider what needs to take place potentially during either pre-postmortem or postmortem.
And so open to officers in 2015 to liaise with the fiscal in relation to ID.
Yes.
And we may be hearing evidence at a later hearing from David Green, who was in Crown Office, who was a fiscal. Were you aware of David Green's
I think he was head of
involvement?
fatalities for Scotland at that time.
And we may be hearing that we may hear evidence from Mr. Green in connection with that. Is identification something he could perhaps assist us with as well?
It would be, but prior to even contact him, we would do everything within our power to try and identify as best we can, to demonstrate the efforts that we'd went to either indicate this was the person, or if we then couldn't, we would obviously look for that consultation or the next steps.
So you're doing your best to gather in as much information before you would bother the fiscal or
correct.
ask him for guidance or advice?
Yeah, they would be notified of the circumstances at an early stage, I would imagine, but potentially not specifically about the identification if we were posed a problem.
Thank you. And I've asked you about the mobile phone. Were you aware of any officers who'd attended at Colette Bell's house maybe recognising a photograph of Mr. Bio in the house?
I'm unsure of that, and obviously when you refer to officers, it could only have been one of the three detective
Well, there
constables
was
that were deployed.
Parker, Mitchell and Clayton.
yeah.
And we've obviously got a number of statements, both DC Parker, DS Mitchell have given evidence, and they've given evidence about a number of statements they've given to PERC and self-penned operational statements. And there may have been part of that, it's available for the chair, part of that might be that I think from memory Clayton had maybe recognised a photograph on the fridge.
I take it as that retrospectively in terms of recognised, in terms of his...
When they were at the house
So
of
there was a
Colette
photo,
Bell.
and I take it as he
Yeah.
made that link after.
No, he recognised, as I understand it, the photograph on the fridge as somebody he'd gone to the gym with.
All right, okay. I didn't realise that there was a
That-
personal connection. No.
Was that
I don't
something
recall
you were
that, no.
aware of at the
No.
time? No. All right. But maybe subsequently, that's the type of information you're looking to gather in about identification.
Yeah, yes, we definitely would consider any eventuality at that time with the main purpose of trying to provide identification.
Thank you. Can I ask you again to look at your first inquiry statement, please, SBPI 00133, and if we could look at paragraph 105. That's that on the screen. Just to explain, this is in a series of paragraphs that relate to when you're back at Kirkcaldy Police Office. You've been talking about the officers, attending officers had gone to the canteen, and you're talking about this situation that arose at that time. That's in the morning. You've been asked a number of questions about various aspects of what was going on in the canteen. And 105, you say, I think that probably led to some potential miscommunication and delay in messages that we got. We were pretty familiar to deal with these things. Yeah, it wasn't great, that was our own officers, but given the experience across the board of the people dealing with it, it was pretty routine. And I'm not being dismissive of it, but as process procedures that were routine, once we've covered the bases and secured that, it's easier then, and it sets the tone, the foundations for any investigations. And I'm hoping that you'll be able to put this paragraph into some context and explain to us what you're talking about here.
I think maybe 104 helps lead into that potentially. I don't know if there was a...
Yeah, let's look at 104. So we deal with the line management and rank structure. What was conflated was the fact that PERC was a fairly new concept, basically, but about 2 years old. So I hadn't been involved with anything with PERC because the original thing was stop, do nothing. That to me had to be the conventional response to the incident, and there was stuff that was already in train that just couldn't be stopped.
Yeah, and leading into 105, I think it was, from our experience of all officers on that day, we were pretty used to dealing with death investigations in terms of each of the elements and the processes involved with that.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was trying to say with the involvement of then the police contact probably caused, whether it was certain angst or confusion to how we would deal with it, but the reality is that we shouldn't have dealt with it any differently. But at that time, in terms of the briefing up, in terms of to our senior officers, with the involvement with PERC, led to some obviously instruction for them then, whether it was regards to their intentions and purpose, all of which we were kind of unaware of because it was a new concept. So we were quite satisfied how we deal with deaths on a daily basis without this new concept of the PERC and what they would bring to the investigation.
So, and to what extent did the existence of PERC cause issues for the police that day?
It maybe led in terms of, certainly, and I can only speak for myself, in terms of second guessing my own actions and decisions and balance them again. Is this something that is in line with what PERC's expectations, also senior managers as well? Because at that stage we were, and I think as I detailed in my first entry in the day book, is covering those basic strands of any investigation. That sets the foundation for any investigation and sets the tone of how it's progressed from there. If we don't get the basics right at the time, then obviously that could lead to potential problems in the future in terms of investigation.
And where you talk about the original thing was stop, do nothing, what do you mean by that?
That was effectively the message. So in terms of the kind of chronology and timeline of, and we discussed it yesterday, at the point I phone the detective super, ordinarily I am briefing to him what's occurred, what I've done, what I'm intending to do. Usually you get some form of concurrence, approval that is, but with potentially other considerations given his experience and oversight. And then we would normally just go and proceed with that to then provide a further briefing at a poignant point to update him on the progress of it. Naturally, with the police contact, PERC were going to be informed, whether they had been informed at that time, but the messages come back seems to have been influenced by PERC in that contact. obviously that was Detective Super Campbell's role at the time, and it was Parker coming to take over this. To ensure independence, transparency, we need to stop, because obviously any further involvement by peer division officers could affect the independence, transparency of the investigation. But in reality, that wasn't possible. There has to be some form of transition, handover. But again, we hadn't had that before, so it was the unknown. I think that probably caused us to give more thought and over-engineer what was basic considerations and decisions.
So you had a normal way of dealing with things and investigating an unexplained death. But because it was officers involved, PERC were going to come in.
The officers and also PERC. Again, we've had incidents where officers potentially involved previously, but not maybe to the scale and the scrutiny that we thought was going to come. But again, we didn't know because it was an unknown entity at that time.
So this situation with officers involved was unusual.
Yes.
Never dealt with anything of that scale before. No. And then having PERC brought in to take over, that was unusual as well.
Yes.
Was this the first time you were aware of it ever having been done? Where PERC came in?
I think so, obviously, from a Fife divisional perspective, yes. I'm unsure of the rest of the Scotland. And
in here, you seem to be saying the original thing was just stop and do nothing.
But we'd already responded. We were public facing. There was an expectation, as there are every day, for the police to respond and act. And so we couldn't just walk away. We'd already engaged witnesses. It's smacked as the kind of potentially process, whether PERC had guidance at that time versus what was the right thing to do. So I knew there would be involvement, but a handover at some point, not to stop, seemed to be the initial message.
Was there any indication at that stage how long you were supposed to be stopping doing anything for? And you've indicated your police officers. How did you feel about the instruction to stop what you were doing? Again,
because we were used to and had the experience of dealing with these matters, to suddenly have, and it's not about a control thing, but we are responsible. And again, my job in the day trying to lead these officers is to the best of my ability was being, and by no means it was being undermined. It just conflicted against what was the right thing to do. And even if the stop isn't accurate, and that's just my interpretation or understanding of it, even some form of arrangement that potentially wouldn't start a new line of inquiry, that would maybe just consolidate and secure what we had, that seemed to be the common sense, because at that time we had more than enough to be getting on with the resource that we had.
When did you hear this original thing that was to stop? When were you told that was?
It wasn't in the early conversations with Detective Super Campbell, because that was more briefing on the circumstances. Mm-hmm. He is naturally, I assume, went away, briefed up again, and then I don't know, you'll be able to tell what time PERC were. So again, was this Detective Super Campbell's opinion of what would be happening, or was that influenced by PERC? I don't know, but it was definitely round about the time that was starting to brief DS Dursley and the DCs in terms of deploying to carry out actions.
We looked at the spreadsheet, the combined audio and visual timeline yesterday, and we looked at the airwaves transmission where you said you were going to be contacting Detective Superintendent. Was it sort of shortly after that period that you were? It
would definitely be between that and the time that I having returned to the station along with the officers then in canteen, was definitely round about that time, because there was also instructions in terms of how they would wish the officers dealt with as well.
So let me just the call that we looked at yesterday was on the final page of the spreadsheet, 16, and that's at the very top of page 16 of the spreadsheet. So this is 7:43:05, and this is you just for the call card. DS Dursley from Leavenmouth is arranging a CID resource from Division to attend at Kirkcaldy Police Station in relation to the aspect of the investigation Chief Inspector Stone's updated and is going to contact the on-call super, who we know was Pat Campbell.
Yeah.
And you said that Kirkcaldy Police Office wasn't far from Hayfield Road.
That's correct.
And you'd travelled there after you left the scene.
Yes.
I don't think you were able to give us an exact time that you arrived at Kirkcaldy yesterday.
No, it was definitely, so from that transmission to then, I was definitely in the police station when I knew about when Mr. Bow had been declared dead. So you're talking within the space of an hour in terms of the initial phone calls, and I obviously talked about the frequency of them, rightly so. So it was definitely within that period, probably towards the end of that hour as opposed to the start of it.
And so within that hour, you're aware at that stage that PERC are going to be brought in and they are going to be taking over the investigation.
Yes.
And what you say here in this paragraph, I hadn't been involved with anything with PERC because the original thing was stop, do nothing. And so you were aware within that hour
Yes.
that really you were to leave it all to PERC.
And then I think it was, and again, further discussions will play out in terms of PERC. Again, not the available resource that they had at that time, that again, to try and demonstrate that independence, transparency, that it seemed to move to P Division officers were no longer going to be involved and that they were going to look for support from our major investigation team.
So they were going to remove P Division officers who had, it was P Division that were part, the response team
Yes.
were in P Division and they were the responding officers, the attending officers at Hayfield Road.
That's correct.
So they were going to remove P Division's involvement at all.
And I think that extended to me and the other colleagues that I've outlined as well.
Right. So that there was that independence and
Yeah.
transparency.
That's correct.
And in turn, you said the major incident team were going to be brought in
Yes.
instead. Are they separate from the CID, crime management?
So they're a national function that are located at, regionally, effectively across Scotland.
We've heard some people call them MIT.
Yeah.
They were going to be brought in. Now, the other officers that we heard evidence from DS Dursley that a number of officers were brought in. He had a list in his daybook.
Yeah.
He didn't know who they were, but they'd been brought in from different areas. Some were from other offices in Fife. Were they part of P Division as well? Were they going to be excluded, or how was it going to work with MIT coming in?
So again, I think it was to demonstrate, and I don't know obviously the kind of capacity of PERC at that time in terms of their investigative, I'm not saying ability, but in terms of the resources that they had. So I think it had been agreed or negotiated that, again, to best demonstrate that independence, we would use officers definitely not involved, that were on duty of that morning in Kirkcaldy and directly involved. Perhaps we had to at that time, owing to the availability, the resources used officers from elsewhere in the division that day. I'm unsure of it, but I do think that, or I don't recall seeing anybody else that I was familiar with, that it was officers from the MIT. I think there was officers, detectives from Edinburgh. I think they were the first to come across, again just probably because of the location.
There was a reference, I think, in DS Dursley's daybook to officers from the Lothians. That would be Edinburgh.
It's just a neighbouring division, yes. But whether they were part of the MIT or Edinburgh division, I can't be clear.
So who was responsible for trying to have a dividing line, if you like, between the Kirkcaldy officers, the P Division officers, the MIT officers? Who was in charge of that?
So undoubtedly until Detective Super Campbell arrived, it would be me. I think we'd again negotiated, agreed that for the officers that were already engaged with some of the inquiries, they would continue with that, because again, without that, we wouldn't be able to gain the information that we needed to help inform and build the timeline of events. Again, they didn't come, it took some time for them to travel. I would imagine whether they're even on duty at the time, I don't know. So really I never gave a further briefing to additional staff and directed. We pretty much more consolidated what we're already doing. So obviously you've heard from DS Dursley in terms of the 3 DCC deployed, which were more or less then taken up with Colette Bell, obviously explaining about DS Davidson and DC Connell, more in terms of the locus and the hospital, Mr. Bio. So we didn't really kick off or commence any other further strand of the investigation, and I certainly didn't allocate any real actions after that in terms of the deployment of staff.
So things you'd already started, the visit to Colette Bell by Mitchell and Parker and Clayton, the locus protection measures that were being carried out at Hayfield Road involving Davidson and Connell, and then subsequent work done on identification at Victoria Hospital. These things had been put in play already.
Yes.
You continued with those items of work.
Yeah, because they were crucial.
They were crucial. You said things were a priority.
Mm-hmm.
ID was a priority. And they continued to have officers from P Division working within them.
Yes.
As well as others such as Mitchell and Parker who
That's
had
right.
come to the area. Any other particular avenues that you were exploring at that time which you continued to do?
That was more as the officers that had obviously been brought back to the police station. That up until the first goal group at 11:30 pretty much consumed me in terms of all those, trying to coordinate all those elements and get the best possible picture so that I obviously could brief that first goal group.
So we've heard other evidence that the officers were brought back to the canteen at Kirkcaldy, and that was dealt with in the morning,
Yes.
in the normal way. Anything else you can think of now that you just continued to build on and you didn't stop?
So I know, and obviously I've got the name written down there in terms of other witnesses. I don't recall it, but I know that DS Dursley maybe used resources to facilitate that in terms of tracing Martin Dick and Zaid, because that information had come from Colette. So again, would be important to build in that timeline of the precursor to obviously Hayfield Road incident.
So you continued to trace Martin Dick and Zaid?
Yeah, in terms of being a witness, and in terms of Zaid was be the witness and the welfare element, knowing that Colette Bell's initial information about some form of altercation between him and Mr. Bio.
Right. So that work continued with yourself in charge and the some officers from P Division, some officers from other areas.
That's right, and I think by that time, as explained, obviously the role between me and the PIO would be getting some form of uniform support as well. One, to continue to police or respond in Police Kirkcaldy, and potentially with the locus protection initial door-to-door perhaps.
So there was initial door-to-door at Hayfield Road or in that area as well?
In the immediate vicinity that we looked to capture at an early stage, yes.
And yesterday you mentioned CCTV, looking for that. Was that something you continued with?
They definitely, mainly from the kind of nucleus of Hayfield Road. I think I'd mentioned about the TSU for the van. To be honest, I think without having to go to the addresses, that naturally because of the police presence in the situation, that I think occupants from the houses on Hayfield Road had approached the police.
Could we have a brief look at your daybook again, because you remember yesterday you told us about page 1 and you talked about some generic topics, if I can call it that, or areas of investigation.
It's just investigative strands.
Investigative strands. And maybe just very quickly, if you could go through those and tell us which ones you'd started and continued until the handover.
Yeah. And as I say, these collectively, which discussed with me and DS Dursley for the available resource. I think that I mentioned yesterday the TSU in terms of the CCTV in the van. And again, I think as we learned potentially it hadn't been working, but I think we thought, well, until the TSU comes out, who were the technical support unit, it may be the case it's not visible, but it may have been recorded in the background, so we wanted to, so they were they were contacted for that. Whether they deployed on that day, I couldn't tell you, but we'd secured the van as part of the locust protection measures in any case, so that wasn't going anywhere. The deceased, in terms of the identification and like medical next of kin, was all these checks that we would look again with a view to identification. The locus, again, we've talked about putting the measures in place there with the provision of 316 photos the same. It would be a scenes of crime officer coming to capture the scene as is. It's fairly routine as well, especially when we look to hold a forensic strategy and how we will coordinate and how we will examine that scene. So that's usually capture, again, best practice, or helpful that if we capture that prior to any forensic strategy, that imagery can be played to the specialists in the room, which obviously vary in terms of how best we will try and capture the evidence at that scene. Shahid Saeed, yeah, I say that would definitely mean DS Dursley talked about we need to try and contact him from the welfare perspective and as a witness, because he'd been introduced by Colette Bell. And I think, yeah, in terms of Martin Dick with regards to Mr. Bahu being at his house the previous evening or into the early hours, I think I've apologised for my scribbles after that I can't make out. The house-to-house parameters, so that's more a jag to what are the house-to-house parameters. There would be the initial ones in terms of any house premises that is in direct eyesight of the location, again with a view to identifying witnesses. That would probably include CCTV as well, because of the technology and not saying ring doorbells then, but private CCTV that would be incorporated as part of that. Intel profiles would probably relate to any person we encountered witness in terms of building that picture, and the CCTV survey again it's a specialism, it's a role for someone to deploy and identify and capture any CCTV opportunities within that area or any associated area.
And just to go back for a moment, you've told us about the involvement of PERC and the original thing being essentially stop. Who was it that told you that PERC would be taking over the investigation?
Detective Super Pat Campbell.
And did he instruct you or order you to stop the investigation?
There was never an instruction because, well, if it was, we went against instruction because we continued. It definitely appeared that he'd had some form of conversation. He'd brought us to tell you that it was directly with PERC or some other senior officer, and it was more the ask or intention that we try and stop and preserve what we've got, with the intention of them coming in. But the concept of that's great, the reality was completely different.
And knowing that PERC are coming in to take over, and you've basically to sort of preserve what you've done, you didn't simply preserve it, you carried on the investigation. But what impact did it have on you and the steps you took, knowing that at any moment PERC could come in and take over?
It did feel, well, that we knew the spotlight was on it. Well, I put the spotlight on myself in any case in terms of what we were there to do. It seemed to detract for a brief period of time of our purpose and role of being the police on that day. A bit of second guessing, a bit of angst probably, in terms of, am I doing the right thing? But that didn't last long. I think it was probably that contact with DS Dursley when I did eventually make contact to go, right, what are we trying to achieve here? Let's try and bring it back to the basics as I discussed. At that time I'd had a conversation with Detective Super Campbell and more or less negotiated to say, look, we're involved in this, it makes sense that we progress, mainly to help build that picture with a view to, at a poignant time, handing over to PERC. And I assumed he agreed. And again, there was obviously discussions about other elements that there seemed to be not an instruction, maybe an ask or an kind of something that was influence for us consideration.
Right. Did you have a discussion with Detective Superintendent Campbell in person about this matter or over the phone?
No, it was all on the phone, and again, just with the logistics. And I know he was based in the kind of east of Scotland at that time, and the kind of Borders division, or Lothian Borders division, but as I assumed it was at his home address, which was in the west of Scotland. So there would obviously be time for him to travel, and I think I recall the times I spoke to him, he was probably in the car on his way through.
What time in the morning did you have this discussion with him about PERC being involved?
So I think I'd maybe discussed it was. So the first call would be.
Was it just short, the first call that you had
So the
with
first
him?
call, so there were all a series of phone calls from the first notification to him, to what we had and what the information that was to hand at that time, and then probably my plan supplemented by anything else he wished to consider at that time.
Right.
That then proceed with that, and I think the calls were thick and fast thereafter.
And so you made it clear to him you were going to carry on, and as far as you're aware, he was happy with that arrangement.
Yeah, I think it gave that, I'm saying soundboard, but it was justification rationale of here's what we've been asked to do, and I can't recall, and for me to go back to, well, me on the ground, because and it happens on every day. I suppose they're there to kind of pressure test our plans, and for us to, it's not defend them by any means, it's just, well, this is my thinking, this is why, this is what I'm looking to achieve by that, and the whole, really the concept of the kind of decision making model which we've kind of adopted, we had adopted in Police Scotland at that time.
What were the benefits of the approach you took? You be continuing to be involved with the strands, investigative strands that you've talked about?
One, building that picture, building the information, so the outset of any incident, crime, is you're in the information gathering stage. If we stop, that information doesn't get gathered, so if PERC attend, I'm not really telling them as much as I could have. And secondly, perceptions, and that doesn't, from every angle, perceptions of the officers that I'm trying to lead on that day. Check Mr. Bayou, friends, family, public. Again, we're there to provide a service to the public, and rightly so. So I was very conscious of how that would be perceived.
So all of those aspects were benefited by you continuing to be involved and
Yes.
continuing to carry
We'd already engaged, so by withdrawing would do more harm than being able to justify, and I didn't see anything wrong because we'd already started, and again it was for the right reasons that we're progressing. If there'd been criticism, or, well, again that's for us to provide the reasons for that.
Can I ask about the potential delay? If you had stopped in the morning and left it and preserved, not taken any further steps until PERC did come at some later point, what were the potential disadvantages of that delay, that period of delay between you stopping and the PERC arriving?
It would effectively be 6 hours, because I think the first involvement in me was early afternoon with PERC. Don't get me wrong, that's just physically in person. They may have been able to contact us prior to that about anything else we wanted to consider, but that would have involved the officers that didn't want to be involved. Again, I got it from the independence transparency perspective, but we would, again, it would just, the eyes and the expectations of Kirkcaldy local community were on us at that time, even from our own officers as well, of we're a public service, they were there to respond and investigate, so that those core functions were kind of being, by no means questioned, but being affected by what we were trying to achieve by an organisation coming in to do an independent investigation.
So if you had stopped in the morning and done nothing, there would have been a period of around 6 hours where nothing would have been done.
If we're going by the time that PERC landed effectively at Kirkcaldy, yes.
So that would have included the full morning, the details with Colette Bell, all the involvement there, and other things that took place up till roughly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Yeah. And you've said your first involvement with PERC was early afternoon.
Yes.
When PERC arrived, did they have the resources at that time to then hit the ground running effectively.
In fairness, I think discussions had probably been held with SIO in terms of at that time, that kind of handover, as they just discussed at the first goal group, that actions did start to happen, conducted by the officers brought in. So I imagine there had been some form of dialogue decision between PERC and then
But
the
not
SIO.
with you.
Not with me, no. Because it was a case of, I think the instructions for me was, again, that gathering and consolidating what had happened in the morning with a view to providing that brief at 11:30 for the first goal group meeting.
But that was not a meeting attended by PERC.
No.
And to go back to the question I asked, when they did ultimately discuss the matter with you, were they then in a position to continue with the investigation straight away?
Or pick up from what had
Or
all
pick up
potentially
from
been
what you'd
started.
been
Yeah, because
doing.
there had definitely been other actions identified and progressed by officers, whether that had been in consultation and agreement with PERC, whether it was periphery inquiries, and there was obviously other certain elements that they wished certain provisions to be in place before the actions were carried out.
And were PERC able to provide the resources to then continue with that investigation?
Not in the entirety. I think it's a pretty refined resource. I'll recall only seeing potentially 4 or 5, in my dealings with them, 4 or 5 staff members from PERC who attended that day.
When you use the phrase refined resources, what does that
They
mean?
didn't have the resource, given the scale of the investigation, to do everything completely on their own. So I imagine there's something built in that they would use Police Scotland as that subsidiary conduit to do that on their behalf. Again, ensuring that there was independence, transparency to whatever degree.
We'll probably hear more evidence about this in the future. Of the 4, did you say 4 or 5 people from PERC that you were aware of?
This roughly is what I can recall on the day.
Do you remember what their level of seniority was, or what their experience was of dealing with an investigation into a death?
No.
We may hear that some of them were former police officers. Did you know any of them?
I didn't know them as former police officers. I don't recall if I knew that at the time. I knew that during my first interview with PERC, just in terms of that conversation, rapport building at the start, in terms of what they did previously.
And was it a way that they built rapport with you, was to mention their connection with the police?
I think so. Just in conversation, though, it was nothing.
So, thinking back now, what was your impression of PERC when they came in the afternoon?
Didn't really form. Personally, maybe with some of the other delays that no doubt we maybe discuss in terms of my own personal views of what we should have been doing, and not saying I disagreed with them, because again they had the role to play. But really, so my involvement was the second, what I would class as the second goal group, where we more or less for their benefit went over the first goal group. So it involved me like at the start, giving that kind of investigative update, really just that timeline of events from the call, and just walking through the majority of stuff that I've covered just now, supplemented by anything that had been potentially gleaned in the interim period, and then working through the strands of the goal group.
So, repeating at the second gold group meeting what you'd done at the first. You mentioned there you had your own personal views of what you should have been doing. Tell me what they are.
It was frustration. There was things that I thought we should have done quicker.
What were they?
And it was definitely around the family next to kin element.
Can you explain what you mean?
So I think we've not covered it yet, but me being in charge, even pre 11:30, with my discussions around my management team in terms of DS Dursley at that time, with the message that we'd passed to Colette Bell, was with the full intention, or that we would then, having obtained family details, that would be the next port of call, and fairly swiftly thereafter. But that wasn't the case.
Why wasn't it the case?
So when we talk about the stop element, and I've explained how we've kind of negotiated for us to continue, there was, and again, whether it plays it as an instruction, but there was a request or opinion of the park that using separate officers from the Met in terms of the investigation, they were pretty adamant they would want family liaison officers to be deployed from the outset to the family, and not P Division family liaison officers. So again, it was the logistics, because I think when we scoped it, there was family liaison officers available, say, in the north of Scotland. So again, that delay and what was lost, that period of having told Colette to then we know the time that the family were first informed and by who.
We've heard that Mr. Bio's sister and her family were not told until after around 3:10 in the afternoon. Was that of a concern to you?
Yeah, because the purpose of contacting Colette in terms of the importance around trying to fill in the gaps in the information, identify the witnesses. The next bit was telling her that he'd died. But out of that, and in my statement, we've also tried to identify, was she the next of kin? And I think out of that, we've got sister's details. So I've extracted that because that was the information I would look to get back from the DCs to them with a view to go and notifying the next of kin. Again, in line with process, really. Nothing bespoke or to this incident. That's what we would ordinarily do. If the person we were telling that he died wasn't the next of kin, then as part of that process, we go and notify the next of kin.
So if PERC hadn't been getting involved and there hadn't been this stop discussion, you say the next process for you would not ordinarily have been to let the next of kin know?
Yes.
And would that have also involved the appointment of police family liaison officers?
Yeah, and again, it doesn't always. So again, if from a death investigation where we're looking to deploy a flow, we don't always stop until a flow's appointed, because sometimes we're already committed to the family in terms of that initial response. So there's sometimes a point of contact for the family to provide that continuity in the early stages, provide some information. That would then probably lead into a handover if there was to be a flow deployed.
So if you hadn't known that PERC were going to be involved in taking over the investigation, once you'd found out from Colette Bell about the existence of Sheku Bio's sister, Caddy Johnson, what steps would you have instructed in relation to the FLO flow?
I don't necessarily. So ordinarily, I wouldn't have been considered immediately a flow, because it's in every circumstance is not always required if an investigation is going to have that kind of longevity. So I would just look to deploy a resource and the most suitable resource to do that, to let the family know at the earliest opportunity.
We've heard from DCs Mitchell and Parker, who ultimately did go to the Johnsons in the afternoon and pass on a death message, and we'll come back to that. But when you're talking about a suitable resource or deploying a resource, who are you thinking of would have been suitable?
So if I had another couple of detectives at my kind of disposal, them would have considered uniform response. Probably not in these circumstances, but ordinarily we could speak to the PIO, utilise uniform response, knowing that is their sole purpose, and appreciating that any further information may come in due course. And that's how we approach it. That's the kind of style of communication and messaging that we would look to adopt.
So you could have sought assistance from the PIO, who we've heard was Inspector Kay.
Yeah.
And would that have been officers from another area out with Kirkcaldy?
Yeah. If the decision was mine, which it wasn't, would I have deployed uniform officers? Probably not. I would probably look to deploy officers that I knew and that had the skill set and experience to go and deliver a death message, appreciating the difficult task that it is, appreciating the impact of delivering a death message as well.
Whose decision would it have been in relation to the next of kin?
I don't know if I envisaged it again, because with me and Des Dursley, effectively, but without consulting Detective Super Campbell, that it was the right thing to do. It brought Colette back. In the interim period, we'd learned that Mr. Bayo had died. We basically looked at each other and said she needs to know. Unfortunately, I've then not been in control of thereafter, so it would really just be I would look to come out having identified or gleaned the details of the next of kin, as identify a resource to go and do that. Easy enough saying, because I didn't do it, because then what was I telling the family as well? And I know that forms a big part of this.
We'll come on to that. So, what stopped you, once you knew from Colette Bell about Mr. Bayo's sister, what stopped you progressing?
So that's when I learned that, basically, in line with PERC, they want the first contact with family to be from families and officers.
So you knew that PERC were going to be involved then, you knew there was generally a stop on it. How did you come to know that PERC wanted PERC family liaison officers to deal with it after that?
I think I learned, and again, just with the timing of it, I think I went from speaking to DS Dursley, the involvement with Colette, from the information, and pretty much led straight into that goal group, where I didn't know if that time, having fed that in, we were going to get some direction, but it was definitely discussed. I think potentially in notes on my daybook in terms of next of kin.
Look at your daybook for me, please, and tell me if there's something in it that helps you in relation to this period where we're talking about. So prior to your 11:30 Gold Group meeting, is there anything in your daybook that helps us with this?
You can obviously see on the first page that the next of kin's the consideration after TSU in terms of deceased.
Yes.
So again, it's an immediate and again fairly standard consideration of how we investigate deaths. In terms of, so yeah, I think if you look at if I'll scroll down to the next page, so starting at the very top with the 11:30 Gold Group, section 3, down to halfway down, under clothing cut, you'll see next of kin dash flow MIT in a strategy. So by that time, number 2 is me providing the update, hence why I've not been able to right hand speak. When I've started to note number 3, that's me taking notes of the meeting to where everybody else is that's obviously
These
contributing.
are your notes of the first
Yeah, because I think I
meeting.
was going to take, again, just with the available resource, I was effectively going to create a summary of that meeting for evidential purposes. So there, it's remiss that I've not put who said, but next of kin, and well, it might be Detective Super Campbell, because next to number 3 in the head and investigating process, Detective Super, I think that's the points that he's covered. So I've covered up to that stage, and I think that, from what I recall now, Detective Superintendent Campbell has then brought in, following his involvement, and led him through the conversations, no doubt, with senior management in PERC. So at that time, to learn that we're going to go to the family, but with a flow, whether that was suggestion from the MIT, and I think that's what I said in terms of officers out with an associated strategy, which in the main is right, that's what, but potentially further down the line, ordinarily.
So when you found out that PERC wanted a MIT flow, was that at the 11:30 Gold Group meeting, or was it prior to that?
It potentially was, and came up in conversation before, because no doubt, as part of my updates to Detective Super, regards to Colette, the call, early engagement by the DCs in terms of their actions, in terms of her address, bringing her back, the information she gave round about potential witnesses. The death message was, well, we know she's given us the details of the next of kin. Whether he told me there wouldn't be much time, to be honest. I feel that I did that and led straight into the goal group.
But Detective Superintendent Campbell might be able to help us in relation to that.
It
further.
appears from my notes there that section 3 is really the majority stuff that he was speaking to the goal group about.
So although there's no mention specifically there of PERC, it was your understanding that that was the wishes of PERC,
Yeah.
that that's the way it should be handled.
Yeah, because ordinarily he would provide them and with confidence, but we know that he'd already consulted PERC and what the intentions were.
Thank you. Can I now move on to something else in relation to, we mentioned earlier the canteen and what was happening. So this is happening prior to the first Gold Group meeting. Before I move on to those meetings, I'd like to finish this section. Can we look at PERC 00223, please? Page 8. And you'll see at paragraph 5, it starts, sometime between 08:30 and 9 o'clock, I attended the canteen where I was aware that officers involved in the incident were gathered. They were all there except PC Short, who was still at the hospital, and PC Smith, who had driven the ambulance to the hospital. So this is returning to the early part of the morning. The officers have returned to Kirkcaldy Police Office. It's before 9:04, which is when life was pronounced extinct. So at this stage, it's prior to knowing that Mr. Bio had died. And it says in the next paragraph, I spoke to the officers concerned and started by saying I empathised with their positions. However, it was natural there would be an investigation to get an accurate account. I requested that they not actively discuss the incident at this time and just relax, watch TV and have a cup of tea or coffee. Also present at this time was PC Austin Barrett, who is a Police Federation representative. He made no comment at that time. As far as I was aware, Sergeant Scott Maxwell was looking after their welfare. Do you see that?
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about what you said to the officers about not actively discussing the incident.
I don't know if it's helpful. Again, with I think we spoke about it yesterday, the decision, and obviously with Sergeant Maxwell overseeing that, is to take the officers that had been involved in the incident back to the police station. One, in terms of the impact and trauma that it had on them in terms of the welfare perspective, but also to gain control of them to then what the next steps were going to be. At that stage, I didn't know. So during that period, you're aware that I've had certain indication PERC are attending. I was very conscious in that kind of visibility piece of knowing that the officers were there and not avoiding them, is to go down as just knowing how my day was going to unfold in terms of the commitments. Was I found an opportunity to go down. I don't know if it was myself and DS Davison that went down. Just, and it was not about in support of them. It's just really a check on them to probably update them to where I was at and what would follow. Again, with heavily kind of caveated that I didn't know. Naturally, there would be an investigation. Naturally, they would be anxious as a result of that. I could, by looking at them in terms of the kind of state of shock and trauma that we're in, was more just trying to not actively talk about it. And I'm aware now of this thing about in terms of conferral, but it's the same advice if we've gathered other witnesses to say, look, don't talk about it. I was also conscious about while the welfare is putting control measures in, knowing that we would look at some point to get their statements and account from them. There was also the medical considerations in terms of they need anything and the forensic considerations. But first and foremost was as colleagues and having been at there in the aftermath with them was to go down and just show face effectively.
What did you say to them about not conferring?
So didn't say that because I wasn't be familiar with the term. I've since learned, but I think in reflection, they said the same basics. Look, because we need to get an account from you, in what fashion, because of the number and the logistics involved, please don't talk about it, in terms of probably protecting them and protecting the integrity of their evidence. It was more, there were colleagues together, they were in the canteen, just tried to get them to refresh, put the telly on some form of distractive measures, and by all means don't sit in silence, have a conversation. It's very difficult not to then reflect on what had happened. So it was all good enough me saying please don't talk about it, but I knew it was important to try and maintain the integrity of what account they would give. And then, having said that, how was I going to put control measures in place to try and to do that?
Why would the officers talking about the incident impact on the integrity of their account?
I think you put any people in a room and talk about an open forum information about an incident, an event, that it could influence or taint some other view, question other people's views. I think you've already explained in my statement about the years since the incident of what I've seen and heard, and my recollection is sometimes influenced by that. So yeah, just exactly that. The less they talk about, I mean, they maintain their own thoughts round about and recollection of the events.
Is there a way to avoid them talking about the incident amongst themselves?
Definitely, you could have separated them, which was again another request consideration as part of our conversations. And
in terms of the circumstances in Kirkcaldy that day, did you consider separating?
I was asked to.
Who by?
Detective Superintendent Campbell.
What was your response to that?
I think first one would be how, in terms of logistics, because the number of officers, and I've already explained the kind of resource available, and that logistics of how would we do this, but probably more importantly, as I would contemplate, that's why are we separating them, why would we isolate them after this? But again, I think as part of that kind of pressure test, I'm not saying decision, but it was my decision and then not to separate them, is trying to give that kind of justification rationale to the detective superintendent, is that why are we doing it? Protect integrity, that I could achieve the same integrity by putting them in one place, cover welfare, but the control measures of someone independent as we could at that time, in terms of a separate officer not connected, and then the attendance of the federation, our federation rep from the welfare perspective, and that would have been, I suppose, then overseen by Sergeant Maxwell.
Let me just take you through that in a little bit more detail. When were you asked to separate them by Pat Campbell?
It was definitely a conversation before. I think they were either had left or were en route back to the police station.
So this is before the officers have got
during
back?
During that hour of, well, the transmission, it's helpful at 7:45, and then me discussing with Graham Dursley, so within that hour period.
So this spreadsheet, page 16, 7:43,
yeah,
it's from sometime after that period.
Yes.
And then, was it prior to you going to the canteen between 8:30 and 9 o'clock, as we see on your statement here?
Yes, because I think at that time probably, I'm not saying spoke with confidence, but I wasn't coming away thinking I'm going to have to go back and separate them. I think that the decision, I wasn't deciding not to do that. If I got superseding and that changed, enough. But again, we were a lot, by isolating them without the staff and the logistics to do it, would have potentially jeopardised things further, more so in terms of their welfare, if we couldn't do it properly.
So between 7:45 and 8:30, you have a telephone conversation with Pat Campbell.
Mm.
Where were you when you had that conversation?
I don't think I'd returned to the police station by then, and it was all obviously on the phone. And I think that first day book, the considerations about the witnesses, the officers form part of that witness strand in terms of
So were you in the car?
Yeah, potentially.
And it's before you've started your day book?
Yes.
Is there anything in your day book about this telephone call?
I don't think so.
And Pat Campbell asks you to separate the officers. Was that an order or was it a request?
No, it didn't sound like an order. And if it was, then have I went against it. But I think it was like Parker looking for them to be separated. So he became the kind of conduit between me on the ground and then obviously with Park, who were going to be the organisation that came in to kind of lead the investigation. And again, credit to him was the fact that this is what they're asking for, but he was consulting with me because I was on the ground.
And you mentioned logistics.
Yeah.
How easy would that have been in Kirkcaldy Police Office to separate all of the officers?
You have to have a separate room or space for every officer. So again, by that time, with the exception in Cole Short, I don't know if it was seven or eight.
Smith, I think you also mentioned.
Yeah, in terms of who was there.
Who was not there.
Yeah.
So there would have been perhaps around 7 officers.
Again, the control then, with, I'm not saying lost, but with Nicole being shot, being at hospital, what would do more. But again, I think it very came back to why we're doing it. You know, taking the police element away. If these were witnesses to a death, again, it's not saying it's common occurrence, but I've been involved in a lot of deaths where we are transporting a number of witnesses away from a location back to a police station collectively, not separation. If there was forensic considerations perhaps, but again, I think I looked at that. They all had social contact, they all worked with each other. There was nothing in the circumstances that why we would separate them. We know that they had potential forensic, I'm not saying evidence, but their equipment that they still had that wasn't obviously on the roadway. But again, by bringing them back and putting them in one place, we had more control as opposed to that splintered, fragmented approach of isolating them, being on their own. For every witness, we would need then another officer to sit with, if not two. But so it just it very came back to after the how would be the why.
If they'd been civilians, would you have had the same logistical issues and the same issues regarding why separate?
So we do. So on a number of occasions I've dealt with either personally as a DCDS at a location of a death where there is a number of witnesses need their accounts taken for them, or on call, have a phone call, similar circumstances, and ordinarily it is back to a police station collectively until we then have the resource and the plan to how we will obtain that accounts. And it usually just means someone, if not two people, sitting with the group and then separately taken out and their accounts noted.
So would you have treated them any differently if they'd been civilians?
No.
And you've talked about control measures, you've mentioned a few things. You've talked about someone independent sitting with them. So who was that on the day in the canteen?
So I think I've referenced it in the majority of statements, and I've never been told who that was. I didn't identify them there and then and introduce them as this is the person that's going to be sitting in for the reasons why. It was a request, but there's nothing that I ever saw that had been put in place. In the interim period, and again, it's on reflection of having Scott Maxwell there as a sergeant and having that supervisory oversight, but he was more with the welfare as part of his officers. I wasn't asking them to please ensure that your officers don't speak about it.
How were arrangements made to have an independent person sitting in the canteen?
In terms of the Federation?
In terms of any independent person?
So...
Was that through you or was it through someone else?
It was a request of me. I don't know how it happened, but I know that...
A request of you by whom?
Sorry, I requested for it to take place.
It was a request by
you?
you?
As to who allocated that and who done it, I don't know, but I know it happened because I was contacted with the Federation, right?
Who did you request make arrangements for someone independent to be in the canteen?
I can't recall.
Have you got any note or anything of it?
No.
And the request you made was in relation to the Federation being contacted?
Separately.
And you've mentioned in your statements to the inquiry that Amanda Given came from the Federation. And you've also mentioned in the statement we looked at a moment ago, Austin Barrett was from the Federation, and he was there.
And I think he was a Federation rep and on duty potentially. So again, by no means comfort, but it was another support mechanism there for the officers.
And you've mentioned Maxwell.
Yeah.
Were any other independent officers asked to go to the canteen and sit?
So it's my view that I did ask for that to happen, but again, at the time, who would it be? Was the reality in terms of knowing that the officers at the disposal were already engaged in other actions.
Who did you make that request to?
It wasn't the request to. It could only have been probably discussed with DS Dursley, but maybe part is just that working through what we needed to achieve. But effectively, I'd already heard an important job of these officers with Colette Bell. DS Davison was obviously doing stuff at the hospital with DC Connell. So whether I don't know in truth. It was definitely my intention. Whether it was followed through, and by the looks of it, I don't think I've ever seen a statement that somebody was deployed in that.
I'm not aware of any statements to that effect. So do you think that's something that maybe slipped through the net?
Potentially. It was done with the kind of best intentions to have that, but also by having the Federation rep and the supervisor there, it did offer that degree of integrity. If they chose after what I'd asked to discuss, the Federation would be aware, whether she was to disclose that, and Scott Maxwell would as well. But again, it was putting that kind of moral obligation on them, that professionalism to just look, don't discuss it, as opposed to then having somebody then to look over them effect. But it was to protect them in essence.
So one of the control measures would have been an independent person sitting in.
Mm-hmm.
That slipped through the net, but you did have Maxwell there and you had Amanda Given there.
Yeah.
And who was it that told the officers not to talk to each other? You've mentioned you gave...
Yeah.
You had a discussion with them. Were you aware if Amanda Given had that discussion? Did you make a request of the Federation that they tell the officers not to speak to each other?
No, and I don't know if it would be their role to do that. They might have had something to say about it. And again, were the officers clear? Because in what I know now in terms of the kind of conferral is that I've conversationalised the non-conferral effectively. But again, just as because I didn't know how we were going to process and affect officers.
In asking the officers not to speak about the incident, did you expect them to follow that instruction?
I do, and I don't think anybody, again from the experience and the whole kind of integrity of any evidence, that it should have been obvious to them. It was just, I suppose it was a reminder. It wasn't an instruction for me. It was more thinking in line with kind of protecting them and the evidence or account that they were going to provide in whatever format and at whatever time.
Did you consider, as a control measure, monitoring the situation and making sure that they didn't discuss the incident, or was that something you would have expected an independent person to do?
So personally, me?
Yes.
No, in terms of that capacity, that was just one element of a fast-paced incident. There was loads of other things going on. I was unsurprised my phone didn't go during that period as well. But I think that's where I'm of the view that I would bring in that measure to bring the balance of all the integrity of the evidence of the investigation, and then from the welfare perspective, but with a major drive and focus on welfare. And obviously unsure if that's how the officers felt or how that was reflected on the day.
You've mentioned a number of times the welfare of the officers and that being of concern to you. And that's mentioned in your day book. What steps did you put in place to ensure their welfare was being looked after?
So the steps would be, well, I'm saying by not isolating them, but arranging them for them to go back to the police station. to be together effectively. Obviously, a time to refresh. But in terms of any other, Scott Maxwell is their supervisor. Again, I think I said reflected yesterday. Did I ever think that he had the capacity to do it? Maybe never thought or asked him if he was okay or had the resilience to do that, knowing that he would have been affected in some way as well. So maybe didn't consider his welfare.
Looking back now, do you think there's things that you maybe could have done differently? Yeah,
and again, when I spoke about the kind of ownership of the uniform response, it's something maybe me and Inspector Kay could have bolstered effectively. So whether it was bringing in, again, I don't know what available resource was, bringing in somebody else, but I suppose you're introducing probably P division officers, where we've talked about trying to ensure independence, transparency. So that's something that could have been put in place, I suppose, in terms of with the MIC coming in. I suppose you then lose that period where they were unattended, but again, there's been aware of their own kind of moral and professional obligation. Is that I request them is don't discuss it, and we're accustomed to that with court proceedings, court processes as well.
Looking back now, if you could do things differently, what sort of procedures or steps would you put in place that would assist with the welfare of the officers? We've heard evidence that they were there for a number of hours in the canteen.
So again, and I probably did, well, I didn't know that they were there for a number of hours. Again, that frustration is something that I then wasn't in control of in terms of the approach to the officers because of the handover, one to the SIO and then with the involvement with PERC. Not so much for the welfare. I'm annoyed effectively that because I've considered it but not seen it through, that there was someone with independence. If there was to be some form of allegation suggesting that the cops did collude during that period, would be the only. But I've not went from even from leaving the location back to you couldn't cover it all. We'd lost control in effect, or I had at some point when I'm going back together. Did I give an opportunity to speak? Did they speak? Potentially.
And if you'd been in charge of or in control of everything and there hadn't been the involvement of PERC and the instruction in relation to that, what steps would you have taken during the course of that day to protect the welfare of the officers?
I don't know, but I'm obviously now very well accustomed with post-incident procedures. So I know that the main purpose would be getting the statement in the right surroundings. Were they fit to give a statement at that stage? So I suppose you've got to consider their own kind of health, I suppose. Were they, obviously Nicole Short had been to hospital, but were there any others in need of medical treatment from the suggestion that they'd been involved, obviously, in this physical confrontation with someone? So I think first and foremost, in terms of there's a duty to investigate, but considering are they fit to provide that statement. And again, I know if I'd went on to note their statements, it would have been in the fashion of one by one, depending on the available resource and the forensic considerations as well.
And looking back now, I know you had you spoke to them before 9 in. Was there ever a period after 9 in that you went back to the canteen to speak to them?
No.
Reflecting now on events then, what are your views about the level of information that you were giving the officers that day?
So, obviously I've attended fairly, in the recent aftermath of the incident, as I say, by 9 o'clock, obviously it's a couple of hours old. Satisfied with that. I've not went back and feel quite kind of faceless about it, even if I'd had the decency to go back down and say, look, I've handed over. I don't know if that was allocated as well as part of the witness strand. I don't know. But I've obviously talked about the visibility piece and then kind of contradict myself that I've been nowhere to be seen. So I don't know how that's been viewed, and I know obviously I know the views that have been shared by Amanda Given since, in terms of they've just been left to stew with no information. And I know how that would be perceived if we did that with a member of the public, which again from the outset I've said that's effectively how we should have treated them as witnesses.
And we've heard that it was the Federation who managed to get some food for the officers. We heard evidence from PC Tomlinson that he had to go and find paper cups. So are these the sort of things that if you'd been in control of the situation that day, that you would have made arrangements for the officers?
That's definitely something through, and I'm not saying obviously with Stevie K in terms of the PIO, but then definitely in terms of that, whether it was a station inspector or somebody basically to come out for the logistics of the welfare of the cops, whether they need, as I say, needed fed water. I think, and again, even in terms of contact, I think I do recall talking about, and this is a time probably to send a text home as well. So I'm not saying encouraging use of their phone, but knowing in terms of the media that we've spoken about, is that more just a message to family to say that they're, I'm not saying safe and well, but that they're okay, knowing that whatever processes have been involved in, they might have been uncontactable for a period.
Did you consider maybe restricting the use of mobile phones? Obviously we're all aware of social media,
Yeah.
and the risks of information.
So not in terms of overtly of them using social media, would be a consideration, or is always a consideration with any investigation of, is there an evidential value to that particular phone? Was one of their phones used to record the incident? We weren't at that time in possession of information to suggest that, so there was no decision or control over their phones. And again, on what basis to their personal phones?
Is there any monitoring of, there's been a lot of publicity lately about WhatsApp and text messages. Was there any monitoring of social media or afterwards?
Potentially, but not a consideration of mine at the time, or considered after. Well, I did obviously see the social medias, but not. But in terms of the officers' use of WhatsApp and.
You've said that you know now about post-incident procedures, and I'm sure we'll hear more evidence about that. In 2015, were you aware of post-incident procedures?
I can't say that was, no.
Had you had any training or anything
No.
in that? Was there any consideration given by you on the morning to provide legal advice to the officers?
No, and so it wouldn't be my role to do. I think probably as part of the Federation deployment would be something that they would consider separately, as opposed to anything that we would provide internally.
We've talked about the possibility of the officers being separated, and that you had a discussion in the vehicle on the way back to Kirkcaldy with Pat Campbell about that. We've not heard from Pat Campbell yet, but it's possible that the Detective Superintendent Campbell at that time was of the view that the officers shouldn't be separated unless there was a requirement to separate them, such as the type of requirements that you've mentioned. And insofar as you've said today, and insofar as your statement says that there was pressure from Pat Campbell in relation to separating the officers, it may be that he will be saying he didn't think they should be separated.
I didn't know if he provided a personal opinion. Again, it appeared that it was a request of someone else, which would be Park. Because to be honest, if it was an instruction, having made the decision to gather them collectively, if there was an instruction, then either when I went down at 9 o'clock to see them, that's when I would have been telling them, and this was going to happen. But again, back to the kind of how and why.
Right. So if we can look at paragraph 103 of your inquiry statement. Sorry, I don't know if it's the... Let me just check. I think it may be the first... No, I think it's... Oh, it is. It's the first inquiry statement, and it's paragraph 103. So you're talking about the officers knowing there was going to be an investigation, significant witnesses. I didn't classify or brand them as what status they were, but until we knew how we needed to progress, this is the best way to do it. There was pressure for me to separate them, but I didn't have the officers to do it. I didn't have the logistics to do it. They all had the social contact through working together. They'd all been in the same place and all returned to the same place. The pressure to separate the officers was undoubtedly from Pat Campbell. Did you feel that pressure was being applied to you by Detective Super Campbell?
Constantly, and rightly so, because, as I say, he was there to kind of pressure test my plans, my actions. But again, in a supportive way, and try to do the right thing.
So is there a difference between pressuring you and pressure testing?
Yeah, but I got the view that he was the messenger, and the fact that if without the involvement or need for Perk on this day, it's something that we would, and that's healthy, is just to discuss challenge, I suppose, in terms of, well, why, for what reasons. There was by no means any kind of comeback from us. Well, I think I could achieve the same in terms of the integrity of the evidence balanced against the welfare of the officers by just keeping them where they are until we have a plan, but more importantly, a resource to deploy the plan. Because if I was to separate them, I would have lost. If I separated in the town, I would have lost control, and I think that would be more detriment to the investigation. One, in terms of potential evidence, and from more importantly for me, the welfare perspective and the impact on the officers.
And what control was it you were trying to achieve at that time? In what respect?
It was to balance the needs of the investigation and the welfare of the officers, and did finding that balance again, knowing that the whole concept of what I know now in terms of post-incident procedures, in terms of the ECHR plus the duty to investigate.
We know that when you were in the canteen that morning, Nicole Short wasn't there, she was at hospital, and Smith had driven the ambulance to hospital. Can I ask you about DS Davidson? She was obviously at the scene. She was there before you.
Yeah.
We've heard that she was going about her normal business in Kirkcaldy that day. Can you explain why she was not asked to remain in the canteen with the other officers?
I think I've obviously tried to deconflict of the officers that were directly involved in the initial incident, appreciating that Sergeant Maxwell, DS Davidson, DC Connell and myself were in the aftermath. So if we're to include Sam in that, it would have then included me in that, because I was there, but it was just separating who had the physical involvement in the incident versus the attendance thereafter. So I was quite satisfied. It's a right thing to consider, but I kind of saw her degree of independence from the actual incident. She turned up in aftermath. If she'd been involved in any form of restraint or had become actively involved, then she definitely would have been considered as part of that.
That's not a distinction you applied to Maxwell, Sergeant Maxwell.
No, because I think I saw him as that supervisory. So I think I still had him on the periphery, effectively, in the canteen. He was there to oversee the welfare of his officers.
Did you see, when you talk about periphery, is that periphery to the events at Hayfield Road, or
yes,
that he was continuing with a welfare supervisory role in the canteen?
The first line manager's responsibility, but again, on reflection, probably be more helpful to include him as part of that, so that he's with his team and that somebody else had that responsibility. And as you've outlined, in terms of who was going to actually ensure that they were suitably refreshed. We
talked about Maxwell yesterday and his involvement at Hayfield Road, but then his presence in the canteen. And looking back now, do you feel adequate steps were taken to protect his welfare that day?
I don't know, but not by me. And as I say, that's something I do regret.
I appreciate the
Shall I have a
time.
break now? 20-minute break. That's correct.
Thank you. Before we leave the issue of officers' welfare to one side, can I ask you about any involvement you had on the 3rd of May with a Conrad Trickett? We may be hearing evidence from Conrad Trickett that he was post-incident manager.
I had no involvement. It's only in recent time that I knew he was actually deployed.
Right. I'd like to ask you some questions about the police equipment. You've talked about the canteen and having control, including control of equipment, and you've talked about integrity. Yesterday, you mentioned that you were told during a conversation with DS Davidson and Sergeant Maxwell that Nicole Short had been stamped on. And we talked about it yesterday in connection with a later comment you'd made about her being stamped on the head, and you explained that yesterday. But I'm interested in knowing in the morning at Hayfield Road that there was a suggestion she'd been stamped on, what impact that had on the way you approached the investigation regarding preserving the forensic integrity of clothing or equipment.
Obviously, at the time, there wasn't really, first and foremost, that wasn't my priority consideration. It was the kind of medical attention, and that was the purpose of taking her to the hospital. And again, not knowing what was then going to ensue, it wasn't a consideration in effect. And to be honest, with everything else that then went on thereafter, Nicole Short was a concern in terms of her welfare. I didn't get to the point where I was considering the forensic value of, or potentially of, medical examination of her and or equipment that she was wearing.
Right. Was there, you've mentioned that in your day book there's reference to a strategy regarding next of kin, and I think in your evidence this morning you talked about forensic strategy. What involvement did you have personally in considering a forensic strategy?
I never got to that stage. My involvement effectively ceased by then.
Do you know when there was consideration given to forensic strategies?
I think there was a forensic strategy meeting in the afternoon, but I wasn't part of it. So I think by that time, obviously whether that was arranged by PERC or arranged for PERC, I don't know.
So you don't know whether Pat Campbell was involved in that, perhaps?
Potentially.
Right. So when you were obviously aware the officers returned to Kirkcaldy Police Office. We've heard evidence that certain pieces of equipment were retained by the officers and in the canteen in the morning. Were you able to see those items on a table in the canteen?
There was definitely their officer safety equipment, because I think they took off their vests and their belts for which the personal equipment would be attached to it. So I was aware of it. They had obviously taken it off.
We've also heard that certain pieces of equipment like vests were left on the floor or leaning against walls in the canteen. Were you aware of that?
I wasn't, but that's plausible, having taken it off where they would put it, and there wasn't control measures put around about that.
At any time when you were involved as SIO, did you consider recovering that equipment at an early stage?
Yes, that was an early consideration, but obviously negated with the instructions that I was getting from Detective Super Campbell. I was satisfied that they were in the one place, but having discussed in terms of the provision, it wasn't in terms of somebody independent. Could that stuff have been moved or been, not saying tampered with, but yes, so that would probably affect the integrity of it.
Was that something you considered or attempted to avoid in the morning?
Again, it would be the how, because obviously you need a resource to retrieve items and the continuity of recovering that. So I think whether it was subconsciously, I was satisfied that the officers and the remaining equipment were in one place, and we had measures to control that in the interim period until a plan was around how we were going to process them in effect.
Are these the control measures we discussed before the break?
Yeah, and the one that seems to be missing in terms of someone independent, yeah.
And what resource would have helped you in the morning to take more active steps towards recovery of these items? You've
So
talked about resources.
Yeah, you would certainly need at least two if you were going to deal with them, as I say, having dealt them as a collective, to then deal with them one by one. But the plan never got as far as that, because as the first move to recover those items, as the first move to try and get some form of account for them, or as the first move to ensure their welfare in terms of do they require any kind of medical attention.
We've heard other evidence that an FME was later contacted, a forensic medical examiner, a Dr. Norrie. Were you involved in any way with contacting her?
No, but it's obviously plausible, and it would be a consideration if I was, in the circumstances, allowed to kind of progress with the investigation.
Is that something you would have been involved in had you continued?
It would have formed part of the forensic strategy for every element of the locus. As I say, you've obviously included Nicole Short as part of that. Is there medical evidence to be captured?
And forensic evidence,
Yeah.
perhaps. And if it had been a normal situation, as you've described before the break, when would you have implemented a forensic strategy in a normal situation?
They usually take some time to pull together, because you're obviously involving partners in terms of potentially procurator, fiscal, and your experts from the Scottish Police Authority, depending on the nature of it. Sometimes these discussions can happen prior to the forensic strategy. I mean, if there is urgent immediate actions to take place, as I say, just the whole logistics, it takes time to pull together. And I think that's why the importance that, as part of the investigative strands, is that you can secure and consolidate what you've got to allow for a more detailed plan and process priority how you will work through that.
Thank you. So in the normal course of events, when would you generally expect to be considering your forensic strategy or preparing to discuss your forensic strategy?
It would be in the hours after the event.
So would that be the morning of the 3rd of May?
Yeah, knowing that obviously you would, with this being declared a critical incident, you would have your goal group meetings as well. So if the way I saw it would be a goal group, which would then help inform also your forensic strategy as well. So it would happen thereafter.
And if we look at your notes in the day book, on page 2 of that gold group meeting at 11:30, can we get? Is there anything noted there by you that would assist us in understanding what your views were at that stage, or what was discussed at the meeting, I should say?
In terms of a forensic strategy? No,
Yes.
but each of these elements would have an associated strategy. Each of the strands that I talked about would have an associated strategy outlining what your objectives are and how you would go about achieving those objectives.
So where would we see the line that would then lead to a forensic strategy noted here? I mean, if there is
Yeah,
anything
I
that
don't
you
know
see.
if a specific reference to it, but there is part of that naturally in the narrative and discussions that there would be. I mean, we are mentioning about obviously the procurator fiscal in terms of the fatalities. They're part of the partners that would come around to discuss that. It's I'm not saying it's not a priority at that stage, but the goal group is the overarching elements of every aspect of the investigation, and then separately strategies for each. The forensic strategy would take place with partners, again usually in person. Obviously changed now in terms of the remote ability. I don't think I specifically speak to a forensic strategy there.
But you would anticipate at some point.
It's a natural progression as part of that. That's why we're doing all that. As I say, that's why we're doing all that early investigations and securing stuff to assist with the forensic strategy and how we will work through that and achieving best evidence.
We've heard evidence that at Hayfield Road there was the discharge of CS and Pava spray by different officers. I'm interested what that would mean for you in your role as SIO in the morning. Is that something that you would have to take account of? Would you have to take particular steps regarding CS or Pava spray?
So The discharge is obviously measures after in terms of aftercare, in terms of the exposure to that. That probably wouldn't be my role. That would be individual officers, a person that's potentially being subject to it as well in terms of aftercare. And then thereafter there's a process in terms of the administrative, in terms of the deployment of that. That would probably be then fall to the line management of the officers. From a evidential perspective, if it was linked to the investigation, that's something as part of that kind of forensic yield that we would look to capture. So we would look to obtain and retrieve the canister and holder that it was discharged from.
Can I ask you about those different elements?
Yeah.
I don't need to ask you about the aftercare. Okay. Would that involve medical matters?
I think there's prescribed guidance in terms of exposure to pava spray.
I'm interested in what you say about the administrative side of things and line managers. Explain that.
So again, and it's my saying limited, but it's been a few years since we all officers have pava spray allocated to them. There's a process in terms of, because I think it's actually classed as a firearm, that in terms of how you store it, how you register by booking it out, how you book it in, and also if you were to discharge it, the forms that you do in terms of that use of force.
We've heard that CS spray is certainly classed as a firearm. Yeah. And in terms of the forms, what do you know about those forms?
I've not had to fill the forms out, and I've not had the supervisory line management of officers that have. It is ordinarily a kind of a uniform, saying function, but it's ordinarily uniform that are used deploying their PAVA or CS. Appreciating there's a difference. So I just know, and again it's from my professional standards days, that there is a form to fill out in terms of any use of force, one for an administrative perspective, and in this instance potentially evidentially as well.
We've heard some evidence that from the 1st of April 2013 there was a memo that was issued indicating that it was a legal requirement to complete use of spray forms. Yeah. Would that tie in with
the same? The same. I know use of force potentially relates to batons, right. And it seems the same concept.
And you mentioned line managers. What role do they have to play in relation to sprays?
I would, and again, I'm not that experienced in it. I would assume it's the personal responsibility of the officer who has it, because they're in charge of it, and if they were to discharge it, they would submit a form explaining the circumstances leading to the discharge and use of it. I would imagine, like majority of processes, that it would maybe go to the line manager for that kind of quality assurance or sign off before it was then submitted into whatever police function kind of coordinated or collated them from a administrative performance perspective.
And so for the officers that day in the canteen, their supervisor, if you like, was Acting Police Sergeant Maxwell.
Yeah.
He's obviously in the canteen with them as well. Who would their line manager be effectively then for the purposes of looking at forms and completing forms?
If it was that day, I'm not appreciating if PS Maxwell was, I don't know how long he was covering, how long he'd been with the team, but whether they, and again the guidance will tell you, whether they have to submit that before termination of duty to the line manager. I think it's on a system, like it's a pro forma system. There used to be a hard copy. I think it's transferred over to electronic. I think, as I say, I've never had to populate one or review one.
On that day, did you consider the availability of forms for the officers when they were retained within the canteen area?
No, because I think in terms of the process of proceedings, that it would maybe something that first and foremost look to do the other priorities in terms of their account statements wise. We've obviously talked about care and welfare and forensic element. That administrative one would probably have come after that, potentially. If ordinarily they've deployed it in line with their duty and they've been well enough to return, complete the paperwork associated with the incident, that would be one of those things. Naturally, we had effectively taken them off operational duties and and kind of secured them pending the decision about how they will be dealt with.
So was that something you had any involvement in at all on the 3rd of May?
No, and I'll be truthful, it was never even a kind of priority consideration.
Who, if someone was considering that matter, who would that have been on the 3rd of May, or even after that?
I would imagine it would fall to PERC, just taken on for what our considerations would be. Naturally, it would be part of their investigative considerations from an independence perspective. That they were naturally going to follow the same processes and lines of inquiry that we would, but just from the independence perspective. So I would assume that it would have, at some point, whether it was a priority, to consider, one, probably the CS from the physical element of the actual canister, and then separately the follow-up administrative, but the cops hadn't been able to get to that stage.
Right. You mentioned a moment ago your experience in professional standards and performance, so I'm interested in why that sprung to mind for you in relation to a question of completing the forms.
So my time in professional standards, with, again, close relationships with PERC and being that conduit with the functions within Police Scotland with any investigations that they undertook, and as part of that we would arrange, if required and the circumstances dictated, copies of those forms to assist with any inquiries and investigations they were undertaking.
Would that be copies of completed forms or copies of forms to be sent to officers
so if
to
they
complete?
No, I think officers would complete them in line with their duties and investigation. Obviously, if PERC were to come in the back of that, they would look, again, as part of that information gathering, to what information material was available as part of the incident that their events that they were investigating.
Thinking about the 3rd of May 2015, what could professional standards have done that day to assist with the completion of forms, if anything?
It's not with the completion of forms that would only really do to potentially collate and gather what was already pre-existing, not to then complete stuff that wasn't already populated.
Did professional standards in 2015 have any role if there was a failure to complete forms?
By the officers.
By the officers.
So again, I don't know in terms of, again, it's the duty of the officers to complete the forms or any administrative function in line with their duties. Failure to do that in terms of what any kind of overt action, it would be a case by case basis in terms of whether that related to a conduct or performance issue of the failure to do that.
If, talking hypothetically for a moment, if officers do not complete forms, such as use of spray forms, and for some reason a line manager does not observe that, monitor it, and require that to be done, or they still don't refuse it, still don't complete the forms, how would professional standards become aware of that situation?
The mechanisms are totally, they vary. This could be an education piece. Does the officer actually have enough knowledge and have they been given the awareness that they need to complete that form?
How do professional standards become aware that maybe there's been a failure?
I don't think they would proactively seek to identify people who weren't completing administrative duties. I think it would have to be identified through whether it was line management, and I think the line management is an education, but if it's a consistent, persistent element that could relate, if it can't be dealt with as performance by the line management, it's something that might be escalated for consideration by PSD.
So if officers are not willing to complete forms that are a legal requirement, it would be open to a line manager to raise that with professional standards?
Potentially.
Depending on the circumstances. Can I ask you to go back to the CS and PAVA sprays? One of the other strands you mentioned was we talked about welfare, medical, talked about admin, line managers. You talked about investigating from the investigative point of view, and the forensic yield, you would retain or retrieve the sprays, the canisters. What steps were taken that morning on the 3rd of May in relation to retaining or retrieving the canisters?
So with the exception of the items that were recorded and recovered, as I spoke about yesterday with DS Davis and DC Connell, which included PP.
Right, you mentioned batons.
Yeah, so I was to say, as part of that, I don't know. There was PP equipment. I identified batons. So if there'd been a CS canister as part of that, it would have been recovered. Failing that, if it retained, it's more likely it's retained on the officers because of the way it's connected to their officer safety equipment. It would be with them at the station.
What steps, if any, were taken by you to retrieve or retain those canisters?
None at that time.
Was there any plan to retrieve or retain those canisters?
Yeah, but be part of the broader plan that I would have, if remained as SIO's consideration as part of the plan, the holistic plan for the officers in terms of their statement, medical, forensic, as part of that would have fallen into the CS.
So that would have been part of a forensic strategy or a welfare issue?
Yeah. I wouldn't have just went in on haste and just taken all the equipment away.
Right.
One, because I didn't have the staff to do it.
If you had been implementing a strategy to recover those canisters, what sort of things would you have done on the 3rd of May 2015?
Again, I suppose it's hypothetical. The way that I would see it, and whether it went against anything that, with the Federation and being there, that they advised against, is that I would have looked to probably do the forensic capture. So the way probably envisaged it, and again, it's just trying and keeping what we do ordinarily, is with the witnesses together as a collective, depending on the resource that you had, whether you could only take one at a time, is you take that one person with the equipment that belongs to them, and as part of that, you're recovering it because you've got that continuity with probably with 2 officers unconnected to recover the items. Consider if there does requirement for any kind of medical examination, and then consider obviously how they're going to provide their version of events. So not do it bit by bit as one officer and do the full wraparound for every element of it.
Right. So the retrieval of the canisters would have been swept up within that welfare consideration?
That full process involving the officers, as opposed to doing a tranche of taking all the equipment off everybody, then going back and doing, so just one officer at a time. If we had the available resource, we could have done 2 at a time, and it is just, I'm only doing it in keeping with what we would do in normal circumstances when we have multiple witnesses, that we would get their statements, and as part of that, is there any associated productions or items, medical samples, as part of, depending with the circumstances of what we're investigating.
You were SIO for the Fife Division that day.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, were you aware that day about an incident which had taken place in Victoria Hospital and a review that had been carried out by PERC in the previous October in relation to CS spray? Is that something you were aware
No, I
of?
think, as I said at the outset, I wasn't aware of any kind of PERC deployment to Fife Division from the inception of Police Scotland to the
This is particularly in relation to sprays. And
So-
can I show you something and ask if you knew anything about
Yeah.
it? Could we look at PERC 04474? And you'll see at the top it says use of CS spray within Accident and Emergency Department, Victoria Hospital, Kirkcaldy, 18 October 2014. And if we can go towards you'll see that this is a PERC document. I really just want to ask you about the page 7 and 8, and just see if any of this rings a bell. I'm interested in the recommendation, which we can just see coming up here. Police Scotland should ensure the procedure on managing exposure to CS spray in a hospital setting is clear and includes adequate guidance for staff, NHS staff, on what steps they should take following a discharge within premises, and that will involve liaison with the health boards. And then there's a section that says management of CS spray in Fife Division. During the course of the investigation, the PERC also found that Police Scotland's procedures in relation to the issue, use and the storage of CS spray did not contain sufficient guidance for officers in Fife Division. Appendix C of the Use of Force Standard Operating Procedure merely states the former Fife Constabulary utilises the following forms to audit CS incapacitant sprays. And then there's some bullet points listed. And then it says the investigation found that Kirkcaldy Police Office was not following this limited guidance. For example, the last completed daily control sheet for the issuing return of CS spray canisters was the 7th of October 2014. The Perks inquiries also identified that an email was circulated in Fife Division on the 10th of January 2014 by an inspector instructing that when an officer deployed their CS spray, the canister should be double bagged, a label securely attached to the outer packaging, and then securely stored within the CS cabinet at the relevant station for uplifting the following day. This guidance was not followed in this instance. And it then goes on to talk about other matters and things that had gone wrong on this occasion, which I don't need to mention to you. But can we just go back to the bottom of the previous page? Were you aware that there had been an email circulated to Fife Division about when CS spray was deployed, that the canister should be, and if we can go on to the next page, double bagged and a label securely attached to the outer packaging and then securely stored within the CS cabinet at the relevant station for uplift the next day?
Not aware of the incident, not aware of the email. I appreciate we do get obviously a number of emails in terms of guidance, but I am familiar with CS following discharge being packaged in a format in terms of us, probably from a health and safety perspective, and potential evidential.
Yeah.
So that's not uncommon or unfamiliar with me. As I say, I've never had to package a CS or PAVA canister after.
We've not heard any evidence to suggest that the sprays were double bagged or labelled or stored in a particular place. At this point, we may hear other evidence. As far as you were concerned, before 9 o'clock in the morning, had any of those steps been taken in relation to the sprays?
No.
Were there any spray canisters in the canteen when you attended?
If they're not at Hayfield Road, then they would be in the canteen.
Were you aware of where they were?
No, but I think just with the kind of the way they're attached to, and again it's different for every officer, whether it's their belt or on their vest, that there's obviously a mechanism, it's not a bit of string, but it's extendable, so if it drops, it doesn't fall onto the ground. So I would expect it to be retained on the officer's equipment.
So probably with the officers, if they'd retained their police belt and equipment and things.
Which was, as far as I was aware, was all within the confines of the canteen.
Was it something you considered, you've talked about sprays and the impact it can have on people after they've been discharged. Was that something you considered in the canteen that day? To make sure that there wasn't any interference with officers by sprays that had previously been discharged?
No.
Looking back now, do you think maybe that was something that should have been given priority?
If not by me, then, as I say, with the sergeant as well, in terms of that kind of care and welfare for the officers. And I suppose the personal element, if they have felt exposure to it, they're aware of the aftercare in terms of their own self as well.
We've heard some evidence that if you, as an officer, get spray on you, that can remain for quite a period of time and can continue as you move to release or sort of affect the officer. Was that something you were aware of?
No, and if it was, I suppose I would be relying on either the officer or the sergeant potentially, that if they had been, potentially we could arrange that they remained in the backyard area for the prescribed time to allow it to kind of dissipate.
And when you talk about the sergeant, is that Sergeant Maxwell you're thinking of?
Because, to be honest, I was completely unaware of the individual officers who, one, discharged it, and secondly, who potentially had the effects of it.
And was anything along these lines raised with you at any point by anybody? No. We've been talking about the completion of paperwork. You've mentioned a number of times taking accounts from the officers. Is that something different from the officers completing an operational statement?
I suppose my terminology of taking accounts would be me or arranging for someone to take a statement from someone, not necessarily officers. But in this instance, that terminology is different. But I think what I mean is just getting their account, whether it was provided by them or whether we deployed a resource to obtain it from them, because that's not uncommon as well in serious incidents.
And how can that actually assist the investigation, help you in your role, having the accounts of the officers?
It just helps the information gathering stage, just helps build that picture and support and supplement the information we already have to hand from other witnesses or other sources of material.
Is that something you would have liked to get at an early stage?
Yeah, from any witness, not just the police.
So whether they're civilian eyewitnesses or police eyewitnesses?
Yeah, because ordinarily it is their account, not saying it's best evidence, but the more information we can get, the better assessment of what has happened and, more importantly, what we need to do to investigate.
And we've heard others say that as soon as you can get those accounts, that's better because it's fresher in people's minds. Would you agree with that?
And the basic principles of a witness depend on the circumstances, because they may not be fit or in a place to provide a statement.
So as an officer, what steps can you take to secure the accounts of police eyewitnesses?
So ordinarily we would just be asking for, in the term operational statements, we would be asking for the officers to provide their account as soon as practically possible, unless, in like these circumstances, there was something that would influence or prevent that.
And in the circumstances on the 3rd of May in Kirkcaldy, what prevented you securing those accounts?
So this was basically not a consideration for me, because it was after the stop and pause and the agreement around completing existing actions, my thought process wasn't allowed to turn to my attention to the police officers.
So do you mean you didn't consider that at all prior to the first?
Definitely considered it.
All right.
But it wasn't then my responsibility having the changeover of SIO and then the involvement of PERC.
When did you consider the possibility of securing statements from the officers?
I think with the chronology of the timing is that I knew they were, and again it's part of the securing each of the strands, the investigative strands, the officers were one of them in terms of the witnesses, was that they were there, they were safe, they were secure, and that at a point I would have probably come round to that in terms of the list of priorities, but with the resource and the jobs that we had at that time, I hadn't really got to that juncture.
Was that something that was on your day book? Was there anything in your day book that would help with that, or?
Even just under the broad term of witnesses, the police officers would have formed part of my witness strategy.
Right. So we've got on page 1 of your day book mention of 2 witnesses, Zaid Saheed and Martin Dick. You've mentioned that.
Yeah.
Uh,
I was already aware that, so these were new witnesses. I was naturally aware that the officers were witnesses, so it wasn't a...
Oh, you didn't need to write that down?
Yeah, I was already aware that they were going to be key witnesses.
Right. And we've heard that one of the issues that concerned the officers was their status. And I think in some of your inquiry statements and the other statements we have, you talk about this. I'd like to look at your first inquiry statement, 133, paragraph 111. And you say here, what's my status? Do I have to give him a statement? These were all questions that came after. We know it led to the delay when the Federation made the decision about them not giving a statement at that time, but it was based on the fact that they weren't all safe. I didn't have confidence in where we were going because it wasn't my decision. Ordinarily, these decisions sit with me, but I knew there were discussions going on with PERC and senior management about how it would go. Can I ask you a little bit more about what was happening at this stage? You've talked about the Federation making the decision about the officers not giving you a statement at that time. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
I say the questions that came after, I don't know if that was at the time, because, to be honest, there wasn't much dialogue with the cops in terms of back the way. In fairness to them, they were more concerned about the condition of Mr. Bile, as opposed to any recourse for them. They were naturally, I think, anxious about what was going to ensue, but I don't think from the outset I got anything back about what's my status with my statement, that they weren't in that frame of mind at that time.
Okay, so when it says there, we know it led to the delay when the Federation made the decision about them not giving a statement at that time, but it was based on the fact that they weren't all safe. When you say, let me take you through that sentence, we know it led to the delay. What's the delay you're talking about?
In obtaining, so when, at the point that the officers gave their initial account.
So we've heard evidence that was the 4th of June, just over a month later. Is that the delay you're talking about?
I was probably referring to the delay on the day.
Right.
Because again, I know there was conversations. I've educated since in terms of the kind of PIP and the officers that attended for that. I was genuinely unaware that they'd attended for that. And I know at some point they'd done initial actions with officers before they were allowed to go home. And I think that was potentially the medical forensic capture. So that naturally been the decision about what they would do, and then the discussions around when they would attain their statement. But I was only involved to the point that I'd arranged for the Federation to come to look out for the interest and well-being of the officers. I was naturally aware in the days after that they hadn't given it on the day. I wasn't obviously aware of the date that they then subsequently gave it and the discussions and dialogue around that.
Right. You talk about the delay on the day.
Yeah.
When would you have expected to obtain the officers' accounts on the day?
So I don't know, because
in normal circumstances.
So I suppose without, and again, I know that the welfare thread throughout, I suppose, saying selfishly for me in terms of that line of the investigation, I want to get that information as soon as possible. So I would have, when allowed to come to it in terms of the priorities, the witness strategy with the officers, a resource to go and get their account. But that's me obviously not taking a cognizance of, as I approach that situation, the position of the Federation at that time and what advice they've given to the officers. So, which I obviously understand is that they weren't going to do it. But there was definitely a delay even to deciding the approach in any case.
So from your perspective as SIO, you want accounts as soon as possible. Yeah. That would help your investigation. Yeah. You would need to get a resource to take accounts from the officers.
Unless I was satisfied they could provide their own.
Right. Assuming they are well enough and able to either speak to somebody to give an account or to prepare their own account, how quickly would you have anticipated getting an account from the officers that day?
I would have looked to obtain it before the terminated duty, depending on how long it would take for them and if they were in a position to provide it.
So that would have been your preference?
Yeah, because it was in line with normal process for death investigation. If you've got multiple witnesses, it will take time, and you've got to work through that with a resource available.
And so when you talk about the delay on the date, what is the period of delay that you're referring to? The fact that they didn't give statements that day at all?
I don't think so, because I didn't know how that played out. I think it was more the delay in giving them, either in consultation with them, of getting round to how we were going to deal with them and in what fashion. So, and again, it's similar to the delay I explained about the other elements in terms of the next of kin, is that, and that's where I went and saw them, and even by 9 o'clock, they'll be able to tell you exactly the lack of visibility updates during the time that once PERC have taken on the investigation, they were notified of what will happen to them. It was the delay of the unknown for them.
So it was the unknown.
Yeah, as opposed to the delay that ensued for when they gave their account.
Sorry, I'm not entirely sure I followed that answer. So I was asking you about the period of delay, and am I right in thinking
It's the delay
you
on
would
the
have liked
delay
it
on the
as-
day.
Delay on the day. You'd have liked it as soon as possible,
Yeah.
but you would have had to have got resources in place.
Yeah.
You didn't get resources in place. You weren't part of that process, as it turned out. But that would have caused some delay. So were the lack of resources an issue for you that day?
They were.
Or was it you just didn't get involved in that process at all because of PERC being involved?
So you're right. And the delay, that like with other elements, we got round to actually informing the officers what was going to take place.
So a delay in telling them what was happening.
What the plan was.
A delay because you weren't involved in securing the necessary resources. And a delay in PERC
Yeah.
arriving to take control.
But even if I was then allowed to progress with it, I assume now I would have encountered the same, not saying challenges, but with the Federation to say, well, and then that's when I might have been faced with what's their status, the legal thing. Sorry.
That's okay.
That would have, so it's all good in terms of what I was looking to achieve as investigative strategy, but naturally it had to be in line with.
Of course, and we'll come on to that in a moment, but I'm interested in trying to work out whether there were any levers or strategies that you could have adopted, leaving aside the issue about Police Federation, which I'll come back to. Leaving aside that, were there any levers or strategies that you could have adopted on that date to speed up the process of getting the officers' accounts or to securing the officers' accounts?
I don't think so, because I would have been met with the same challenging inquiries about the manner in which we do it, the potential legal basis.
Right. And then you say in the statement we were just looking at, paragraph 111, so we've talked about the delay. When the Federation made the decision about them not giving a statement at that time, I'm interested in what you say here. We've heard evidence from Amanda Given that that wasn't her decision to make. And her position is she advised them they might want to take legal advice. So what do you mean when you say the Federation made the decision about them not giving a statement?
So again, if Amanda's given that clarity in that on their advice they've decided that, then obviously I'll reflect on that, but it was definitely influenced by the Federation, and that was the main reason that the Federation were called to provide with the officers with any necessary advice and guidance around about that.
So insofar as your statement says the Federation made the decision,
That's maybe just an assumption but the officers made the decision on the advice of the Federation. It would be plausible.
so was there anything that you were advised of or any conversation you had with Amanda Given that indicated it was the Federation making that decision?
No, that's maybe just my assumption. Sorry.
Just an assumption.
Yeah.
So the chair's not to read anything into that.
No, and it does make sense that the Federation are there to provide support and guidance as opposed to making decisions, but naturally be an influential factor in that.
And in terms of the Federation giving advice to officers, you've said that's part of their role, to maybe seek legal advice. Was that something that you could facilitate? A room where officers could speak to a solicitor on the phone or take legal advice?
In terms of police officers, didn't really consider it the day, but during my time in professional standards, definitely before any form of procedure, that would be the right as any person to seek legal advice.
So do professional standards make arrangements for officers to maybe seek legal advice or speak to a solicitor?
But it would be an option to the officer, not something, again, professional standards wouldn't influence. It would just to make him aware of that provision.
And if you, as an SIO, were wanting to secure accounts at an early stage, and officers say, "Oh, I'd like legal advice," is that something you could have speeded up?
Yeah,
Facilitated?
I've never encountered that as during my time as just trying to source or secure a witness statement. I've not encountered that, but I suppose if they were introducing that, I couldn't go against it.
So if an officer takes the view that they want legal advice and they don't want to give an account until they've got that legal advice, and that's on one side, and then on the other, you as SIO want their account as soon as possible, is there anything you can do to bridge that gap, to speed up that process? Or what if the officer just simply says, I'm not going to bother getting legal advice, I won't do anything until I've got it, but I'm not taking any steps?
And actually I don't think I can, I wouldn't be able to compel them to give their account.
So as far as you were concerned, as soon as the decision was taken to seek that legal advice, did that bring everything to a complete halt for you?
But to be honest, again, my involvement had ceased by then. So I obviously did get a readout of that was the stance or position. Didn't have a view on it, but again, whether the time delay in getting round to addressing that element was a factor, I don't know. And credit to Amanda, she was pretty visible and vocal in terms of asking for an update in terms of what's happening with officers, rightly so.
You've obviously worked at professional standards. I'm interested in, we've heard some evidence from DS Dursley, he'd never come across a situation, in fact he still hasn't come across a situation where officers have refused to give accounts in a death situation. And we've also heard that police officers are not in the same position as civilians because they have ethical obligations to help the Crown, and obligations to investigate crime and to assist. I'm interested, from your professional standards experience, whether there is ever a way that the officers can be influenced to or encouraged to give accounts, even if they are concerned about their status and wish to seek legal advice.
And I think that you're key in what you said about the status, that the status is important. And again, in the last 7-8 years, the processes and relationship between Police Scotland and PERC have dramatically changed, enhanced, matured. And it's strong communications from the outset that sets the tone, alleviates fears. So especially with deaths in police custody, death following police contact, serious injury, from the outset. And again, because the close working relationships now have matured, police officers, one, I think there's guidance. Secondly, either from a Police Scotland perspective or PERC, we're saying you are a witness. At that time, the request of a statement, we were looking to that statement to consist of. I suppose at that time we can't compel whether they then still choose to seek the comfort or reassurance from the Federation. That's an option to them. But it's a far slicker, seamless process now because of, and no doubt lessons learned have helped inform those processes as well.
And is that new process providing more reassurance to officers who maybe are in that situation?
Whether it's even processes that existed at the time here, but more just the fact that it's I'm not saying more common occurrence, don't mean that, but it's the whole involvement with PERC is more socialised, more common, obviously the visibility because of their inception, like Police Scotland. And again, from the lessons learned, organisational learning of even feedback from our own officers to how they perceive it, and that's how, I suppose, guidance matures and changes.
So just to go back over what the position is now, from your own knowledge, you say there's guidance available. Is that guidance to the officers?
Yeah, and even just in terms of the role of PERC, the role of professional standards.
And What form does that guidance take now?
I think it'll be all electronic. The majority of our kind of policies and guidance are held within our intranet.
That's on the intranet.
Yeah.
And you've talked about guidance about what a statement consists of. Would there be information available to officers nowadays about what would be expected when they provide an account?
I think obviously even at the right at the foundation, the police and them coming as a probation in terms of the format and structure of a statement. I think what I was referring to is that I would have that open dialogue as their status, the incident that I was investigating, what I understood their role to be, and that what I would potentially look for as a kind of terms of reference in their statement in terms of detail and potentially elements or areas that I would look for them to cover.
And you talk about a dialogue as to status. What is done now?
Just from the outset, they know where they stand, as opposed to any form of confusion or lack of clarity. And again, it's come from, and it's not just with policies and guidance. It's with line management briefings, all forms of kind of continuous improvement, development of inputs to various courses, officers, awareness raising, addressing misconceptions, overcoming barriers, perceptions.
And how would officers know where they stand now to avoid all the any confusion? Is that information shared with them now compared to 2015?
Either face to face, or if circumstances are to be remotely delivered through line management, even if and again for the stuff potentially I was involved, even by email, if it wasn't something as dynamic as this situation was.
So, in a similar situation, if it happened now, you've talked about line management and others, who would be involved with speaking to the officers and sharing information about where they stand and their status?
So I think that's where your post-incident procedures come in.
So would that be a post-incident manager that would be doing that?
Yeah, because from that is an early, one of the main considerations with death or serious injury following police contact or in custody of, that's a mechanism, an early.
And is that considered part of the welfare of officers?
Yes.
And then any other lessons learned in relation to that you want to mention? You've referred to the phrase lessons learned.
Yeah, and even through the forums that we've had in terms of so policy and guidance is good. It gives us a structure to work from. How that's interpreted and applied basically comes down to individuals in terms of their communication. So we would always look as best practice now for any event, any investigation as part of that kind of debrief is, we might think we've done a good job, but if the officer or individuals, and that includes even in the public element with advocacy groups, to tell us, well, no, you didn't do very well and you could have done better, and it's that engagement, and that's how we will try to improve our working practices and the service that we deliver.
But in May 2015, was there any guidance available to officers at that time?
Potentially, but I think because of the infancy that it might not have had the chance to work through that process of the deployment, the interpretation, application of the guidance, to then have that review, debrief of, well, is it fit for purpose? Does it need reviewed or amended?
So far for your briefings and updating information known
just because of the time scales of when PERC came into, and indeed Police Scotland came into being.
We can maybe speak to Conrad Trickett about this further.
Please do.
Can I ask you about another paragraph in your statement, which is 142? I think this is maybe the first one, and I'd like the second one, please, if that's possible. With regards to this incident, I would be surprised if this was something Scott Maxwell would have considered or have the confidence and knowledge to submit on behalf of the officers. I also don't know what year the use of force forms were introduced and how familiar competent officers were at submitting. This is going back to the issue about completion of the forms, use of force forms, use of spray forms. We talked, when we discussed that, about administratively line managers maybe getting involved. We talked about Scott Maxwell. And you said there you didn't think he would have the confidence or knowledge to submit on behalf of the officers. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I think, and again, 141 kind of leads into it. I think it was.
Do you want? Well, we can put that on the screen.
I've got.
Sorry, it's just so others can see. So you talk. Tell us what it is about 141 and 142.
So probably providing that from my experience in professional standards, and as outlined just shortly ago, in terms of PSD being that conduit between kind of Police Scotland and PERC to support them in their investigations, that there is times when they've potentially asked for a form that doesn't exist, and then when we've looked and reviewed that, the officer may have been injured as a result of an incident and be off sick. So the form doesn't exist because the officer wasn't in a position to complete it. And again, I wouldn't expect then either a colleague, in terms of potentially somebody that corroborated them, or the line manager to submit that, just due down to the act, not the confidence that he's not able to and not got the ability, but the accuracy of the information, unless he was there. So what he was submitting, especially if it was then to be subject to scrutiny, I don't think that's something that we would do. We would just have to indicate or record that it wasn't available, or when the officer was fit to return, something that they can do retrospectively.
So just to be clear, you wouldn't have expected Scott Maxwell on that day to be monitoring the completion of forms or to be assisting in the completion of any forms?
Absolutely not. And nobody else for that fact, but without having the full information.
Yeah. And then finally on this, just to confirm, we have heard some evidence that officers were told by different people that they were witnesses, and that may have not been reassuring. Can you confirm for me that, knowing that PERC were going to be involved and come in at a later point that day, would it have been possible for PERC to take a different view on the status of officers?
Potentially, if they were in possession of information that changed what initially was my assessment in terms of being witnesses.
So in the morning, I think you viewed them, you've said, as witnesses, but that may have changed once PERC became involved.
Potentially.
And can you explain why you viewed them as witnesses rather than suspects?
There was just no information to suggest any criminality on the part of the officers from what I'd heard in terms of the response to my observations when I was there, to then information that I'd gathered in the aftermath.
Right, we'll come back to that. You've mentioned how communications with PERC and the police have improved over the years. And can you explain to us how that communication has improved between maybe Police Scotland saying to officers or your witnesses, but the uncertainty about how things would change with PERC? Is there more consistency now between the views of the police and PERC?
I think that, and again, to prevent any like conflict or difference in messaging, I think the PSD is part of that review, and any referral or notification to PERC. I think the information at PSD, so the information I have, if I was notifying PERC of a matter, that would be established as part of that contact. And even if it was Police Scotland reaffirming to the officers about the PERC involvement and clarity around their status. And then when PERC deploy, they would probably reaffirm that face to face.
Right. So the communication now would be improved.
Yeah.
And how does that compare to the situation in 2015?
Well, for me, I didn't have that knowledge. So it was really the unknown, and I suppose that's where potentially the confusion, doubt set in.
I'm going to move on now to events in the afternoon. Before I maybe do that, given I've got a couple of minutes, you mentioned yesterday action logs or action books, and I think we've now got a hard copy available in the folder for you, and I'll just speak to you very briefly about this. If we could put that on the screen, and you'll see that one of the front pages says Police Scotland Action Book, Death of Sheku Bayo. There we are. And it's dated the 3rd of, May 2015. Do you see that? And do you have the hard copy?
I do, yeah.
Can I just ask you some quick questions about this? When was this action book prepared?
So the time of the actions in the middle column saying resulted time and date.
Right.
So, and then that was probably in keeping with the conclusion of the first goal group. So anything that was on my day book would be out, and it's obviously retrospective entries to start with to get yourself back up to speed to where you're at, to then any
Right.
new actions from fresh information.
I'd quite like to go through it. Could we look at the next page, please? And I'm not sure we're going to be able to see all of this on the screen, but oh, yes, we can. There, that's fantastic. So left-hand column, action, time, date raised, it just says number 1. And then it says obtain copy of call card. And is this all your handwriting?
It is.
And then origin source SIO and allocated to you, D.I. Robson. And then the time given in the next column is 1400 3/5/15 date. Does that mean that's when you started writing this at 2 o'clock?
No, that's when it's resulted in but it is indicative of the time I did, because I think I explained during the infancy of it when briefing to DS Dursley that we had the call card, so I was in possession of that. So as I populated the action book, I resulted it because I was in possession of that action. So the action was resulted, and that's part of the kind of the retrospective recording.
So when do you think you started writing the action book?
That would be it, because that was more or less probably at the conclusion of the first goal group meeting.
So this is...
Sorry, that's not accurate. That was 11:30, but not far after that, because that was basically my role after was the summary of the goal group, and then thereafter consolidation of all the information and inquiries to date.
So the first goal group meeting's at 11:30. You attend that. Detective Superintendent Campbell's there.
Yep.
You give the update. You note things in
Yep.
your day book. We've gone through those. And then in the early afternoon, round about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you start preparing the action.
And prior to that, I've compiled the summary from the first goal group, because there was a priority around that for the purpose of PERC attending next. So
As an update to
yeah, so
PERC.
I don't know when the first goal group concluded, but the chronology of the goal group, me doing the summary, because that was the priority to try and, as part of the strategy and all the strands, that was prepared in a Word document from my notes in my day book. And then once I'd submitted that effectively to help assist with the briefing of senior management, I turned to attention of what really my role thereafter was, the action book and my own statement.
And just very quickly, looking through the action book, you said yesterday I was asking you about the events of the morning and what you'd done in the morning before the first gold group meeting at 11:30. Is there anything that you see contained within this book that would assist you in when you were doing things, who you were speaking to, what you were doing?
If it's not in the action, potentially the document or material that the action pertains to, like for the call card, would have a date and time stamp of things. That would obviously be the radio traffic, the updates. Likewise, if it was a statement or a document.
Right. I'll maybe explore that answer after lunch.
Okay, I'll think about it.
Well, we're stopped till 2 o'clock.